Hey, good morning. So we just heard a little bit about the trajectory of manufacturing, and in the last 100 years, as manufacturing has had a roller coaster, rising up, peaking in the middle of the 20th century, and then coming down in the second half of the 20th century, riding along in that car on the roller coaster has been unionization in the United States, peaking in the middle of the 20th century and then coming down in the second half of that century. And I'm really excited to talk about the present and the future of unions with Mary Kay. I want to start off with what I sometimes call a big dumb question. It's a question that sounds somewhat embarrassingly stupid to say out loud, but I think is sometimes important to foreground a big conversation.
Okay.
So why should anybody who cares about the future of work care about unions?
If you care about the grossest inequality of our generation, you care about the ability of workers being able to get a seat at the table and bargain a better life. Because unions made that possible, as you said, in the last century, and I firmly believe that unions can make that possible for service and care workers who are working themselves at 80 to 100 hours a week in 2 and 3 jobs and living in poverty, and unions can end that.
What happened to unions in the last 50 years? Do you think it's that laws changed, that you had a series of laws in the 1930s that were really good for unions, and then the labor law was sort of attenuated in the second half of the 20th century? Do you think that there are some jobs that just can't be unionized to the same degree that manufacturing can easily be unionized? What happened to the labor movement in, say, the last half century?
Well, I think American Factory was an example of two of the forces, globalization and resistance to unions, both by employers and some parts of our government that had policies that attacked the ability of workers being able to join together. And then the fissuring of the economy, subcontracting, franchising, the platform economy grew up around existing labor laws, so 45% of current workers have no legal right to organize in this country now. And then the third thing was the dismantling of unions. And so those forces together meant that the 35% of the workforce that was driving wages up for everyone through their collective bargaining is now down to 11%. And I think in the next 5 years, unless we reverse the trend, it'll be below 5% in the private sector.
Yeah, I'm curious to the degree to which you see that reversal happening now. Because on the one hand, I see in the news media, there's a lot of energy around unionization, a lot of energy around the labor movement. At the same time, when I look at the macro figures, it doesn't look like private or public unionization is rising that much at all. So are we seeing a new dawn, or is that a little bit of a false dawn?
I think we're absolutely seeing a new dawn, from the Google walkout to the teachers' uprising in states to the Fight for 15 in a union movement that's raised wages to $15 for 20 million people and continuing to make a demand for unions for all, no matter what job we do, are incredible indicators that something new is happening. And then I think the Business Roundtable deciding to expand the mission of their companies beyond return on investment to shareholders and recognizing there's other stakeholders is a huge signal that something's changing. And then I think the presidential debate, where presidential candidates are saying we have to address racial and economic inequality, and a key lever is the ability of workers to be able to join together and bargain.
Yeah.
So those are indicators to me that we are going to see a major shift.
That we might be at an inflection point.
Yes.
I have to confess that I would describe myself as a hopeful pessimist when it comes to the future of unions in the U.S.
You would not be a good union organizer.
I would probably not be a very good union organizer.
You.
That's why I'm sitting on this side of the couch
Yeah.
and you're sitting on that side.
Yeah, pessimism, no mas.
Right. Speaking of no mas pessimism, I remember when Fight for 15 first came out, and I saw that there was this push to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. My first response, as the hopeful pessimist, was, God, I hope so, but there is no way this is going to work out.
Right.
And you proved me wrong. Mm-hmm. What does that say going forward? What is the success of Fight for 15 in a handful of states and a handful of cities tell us about the future of labor in the U.S.?
I think that I was back the fearlessness and courage of working people that proved us all wrong. Because you weren't alone. Many people thought it was a ridiculous demand, and then it created a sea change because it took the covers off the idea that somebody was earning $7.25 in New York City for companies that were earning record profits, and that wasn't right, and taxpayers subsidizing food stamps, Medicaid, and housing was also not right. And so I think there was a huge change by public opinion as well in supporting it. And I think what it suggests is this idea that if 15 sounded ridiculous, unions for fast food workers is as ridiculous in people's minds today. But I think we are undeterred, and the more ridiculous that it sounds, the more real we think it's possible to do, because fast food workers all around the world bargain a better life and have one job and are able to raise their families and have their kids do better, and we can make that possible here in the US as well.
I want to talk about automation. Several years ago, I wrote a cover story for the Atlantic magazine called The World Without Work that said, okay, if we take predictions about automation replacing tens of millions of jobs seriously, what kind of world is that going to bequeath? And on the one hand, I have that cover story top of mind, and then on the other hand, I look at the numbers. Unemployment is 3.5%. We have created jobs in more consecutive months than any other time in American history. So there is a lot of talk about automation and AI, but you look at the labor force and it's like, where is the automation? I'm curious how you sort of tie these two ideas together. The feeling that automation and AI is always just around the bend or is very much here.
Right.
And the reality that, look, at the labor force, this is a world not without work, but with lots and lots and lots of work for humans to do.
Right, and 55 million of those jobs are not jobs that people can feed their families on. You know,
Right.
Brookings
Poverty jobs, yeah.
Poverty jobs, 44% of the workforce. And so I've heard fast food workers who were threatened by their store managers that we're going to replace you with robots say, bring it. We'd love to design or help design the robot, because we've figured out things to do that makes our job faster and easier because our brains and our hands work together, and we could transmit our knowledge to the artificial intelligence and be unleashed to do some job that would be really fun to do, because I don't want my son or daughter to do this job the way it's designed right now. And in fact, as kiosks have been introduced into fast food, they've learned that more human interaction is required to help customers get acquainted with the kiosks, and the fast food workers have lots of ideas about how to encourage customer engagement with the kiosks.
What you said that I think is so shocking and fascinating is that when most people think about the introduction of automation to the workforce, they think of essentially a robot. It's always somewhat anthropomorphized. They think of like a human robot walking into the office or walking into the fast food shop and replacing workers, saying, out of the way workers, I am the labor terminator.
Right.
And what you're saying is, no, in fact, the workers are in this sort of picture welcoming the robot, saying, here, I'll teach you how to do the job. I'll teach you I'll teach you things that your own engineers couldn't necessarily tell you about my work. And it suggests, I think really smartly, that a lot of workers understand how to automate their jobs better than the technologists that are actually inventing these automated devices. Tell me a little bit, give me a few examples of workers who might understand how to automate their jobs better than the technologists.
And Derek, in order for the worker to feel that free to automate, there has to be an agreement between employers, government, and working people in a nation that we can wholesale automate aspects of our work and transition the workforce, because there's 4 million people doing fast food work in this country today. If it then requires 2 million in the new automated fast food, how are we transitioning the other 2 to the next wave of jobs that need to be created? Because we want to protect workers, not their jobs. And that is happening in other parts of the world. And I think it's completely possible with a new social compact in the US to unleash the minds of working people that have been doing jobs for 25 years that have a lot to say. Like I told you about this Stanford groundskeeper. He watched the human-centered AI describe at this Future of Work Commission that I co-chair, how they introduced robotic technology for landscaping and drones for surveying the trees. And it was introduced to him, And he had lots of ideas about how he would have improved the design based on 25 years of experience, because he would love to. He said, you know, the lawnmowers have evolved over 25 years, all my equipment has changed. I was kind of waiting for when AI and automation, because it's designed here at Stanford. And then they had techs who designed the drones, and he was like over the shoulder of the tech. Hey, I've seen this tree for 25 years. Every year this branch is a problem. We better move the drone over here. You know, like the interchange, I think, has limitless possibilities. There was a housekeeper at a Kaiser in Southern California. Robotic cleaning technology is introduced on his floor. Because he has a union, he has a say about how it's introduced. He knows that hospital infection is caused when the room isn't clean, because he's seen all the data, he's talked to doctors and nurses, he notices that the robotic technology can't get into the corners. He's worried that the corners are going to be the bacteria breeders and, you know, blah, blah, blah. So those are examples to me of the ways in which I've experienced working people who want to contribute to patient care and employee satisfaction, being in the game to automate. But it comes with a commitment to employment security.
Right.
Kaiser workers have employment security through their unions. So Tree was like willing, okay, yeah, I'd love to not clean the floors. I'd rather spend more time with patients or nurses or other things that I'm required to do.
We're going to go to questions in about 3 minutes, so send those our way. Something that you said that is so important, and so I just want to put even finer point on it, is that it's important to have the mindset of protecting workers, not jobs.
Right.
Because you look at the most common occupations in the US economy today: cashiers, retail salespeople, fast food workers. These jobs—
Childcare, home
care, yep, absolutely. These jobs are not necessarily the fullest expression of human ingenuity and creativity.
Right.
If we lose cashiers in America and create those 2.4 million jobs for those same people to do, we haven't necessarily lost anything. We've still protected the worker. But in order to move to that world, we need a new paradigm from the top down. We need a new relationship between the workers, the employers, and the government.
Right.
Who's doing this right? What countries have got this arrangement between workers, employers, and government right?
Well, Sweden has a really interesting sort of tripartite understanding as they're going to automate trucks. I think it's 1 million truckers are moving into a different role, and the biggest role they're using right now for the people that are in their 50s and there's employment guarantees is they're training, they're influencing how AI is going to be introduced in the truck because they've been doing it their entire life, and they're going into middle schools to talk to students about, if you were imagining being a truck driver, I want you to consider these other things. And the thought was that children who admire trucking would be more interested in having a trucker tell them about the change than anybody else. And so it's a more systemic approach. And then care work is thought of totally differently, where the care workforce is paid a living wage that they can raise a family on, 40 hours a week. There's double the workforce because people aren't working 100 hours to make ends meet. And there's centers for elders to gather and create community and respite work for the workers. And so that was a whole area that Sweden, Norway, and Finland wanted to develop. Germany did a Work 4.0 as they were transitioning from fossil fuel to clean energy. It opened up all this new work that hadn't existed before. How were they going to make the new work the same wages, benefits, and conditions for the fossil fuel workers to transition and for other workers to join? So there's lots of ways in which it's happening in other parts of the world, and I think we just have to figure out our version of that.
And why are unions a necessary part of this picture? If we are going to transform the relationship that employees have with employers, that have with government, why are unions so critical to this future?
Well, the fast food story that we've exchanged, that worker is not going to be as inclined to unleash their creativity and technology if they are working themselves out of their income and security. They'd be happy to work themselves out of that job if they could see the path to whatever's next and get engaged in lifelong learning and things that we know are required to help escalate the future of work in this nation.
I love the idea. It's a totally new framework that I've never really thought about it, but I love the idea of unions as a way of empowering workers to work with technology in order to automate routine-based jobs. Not work, but jobs.
Right.
That's a lovely frame. A question from the audience is there anything that unions should have done differently, let's say in the last 20 years, in the 21st century? Is there anything that unions should have done differently that they should learn from going forward?
Yeah, I think every sector of civil society has lessons that they could learn from past decades, and that's true of the union sector as well. I would say one key thing is that we could have been thinking forward about the shift from manufacturing to service and care and moved more aggressively into reaching out to service and care workers to help them build organization in spite of the obstacles.
Yeah. Second question, how would you create union-style benefits for workers in the gig economy?
Well, this is the part, portable is the word, I think, and how do we as a nation think about how benefits are not connected to our employment and job? So the key lever there, it seems to me, is what are we willing as a nation to think about in terms of education, healthcare, retirement, as part of our social compact that liberates the ability of people to move through employment, because it's not, my benefits aren't tied to my actual job.
Right. I mean, just specifically on healthcare, right now the United States is relatively unique among advanced economies in that we have an extraordinarily large employer-sponsored healthcare law, but we don't necessarily have a national public option. We don't have single payer the same way that a lot of other countries in Europe do. Do you support the evolution of this economy to something that's more like a Medicare for all single payer system?
Yeah, we've been fighting for universal healthcare coverage for the 100 years our union has existed. And especially when you represent workers in home care and child care, and you're working in jobs that have been separated from an actual employer, and we have to create employers under the current law in order for workers to be able to bargain. It's all jerry-rigged because it's so broken right now, and it would be hugely liberating if we could figure out how healthcare was provided for everybody in this country.
Right. I mean, I suppose that it would also probably make your job easier, because if you're at the bargaining table with these employers and healthcare is on the table, then you're using a lot of your time and your energy to making sure that you have the healthcare provisions right. But if healthcare is taken off the table, if you have Medicare for all, or you have a public option or some other form of nationalized health insurance, then you don't need to take half of that session talking about the healthcare benefits necessarily. You can focus on the income.
Right. And I think parts of the labor movement are incredibly proud of how they've raised the quality and the coverage. So the question, I think, in this transition is how do we make sure we build on the best of what workers have been able to bargain with individual sectors in the economy.
Tell me a little bit about your plan, Unions for All. What is that idea, and why do you think Unions for All can be a solution to some of the labor crises that we have in the U.S. today?
Well, when you think about 11% of the workforce is currently bargaining, and wages have been stagnant, and productivity and profits are rising, how do we think about unions as a way to help address the economic and racial inequality and create a way for workers to help drive the future of work? And so we want the ability to bargain across sectors and set national bargaining tables with multinational employers like other countries in the world have for fast food, retail, home care, health care. We want every tax dollar to help finance a good union job, every higher ed job, every healthcare job, all the clean energy jobs. And then we want locals and states to be able to innovate, just like they do on wages. Imagine if New York, California, Illinois, the places that have raised wages to 15, if they could have ways for private sector workers to join together in unions and push the floor up for everybody in the nation.
The last question we have, and you can make this a short answer, is do you think the movie The Irishman, featuring the labor leader Jimmy Hoffa, will help or hurt the cause of unions for all?
I haven't.
I thought it was a captivating performance.
I
Al Pacino.
haven't seen the movie, but here's what I would say. I'd say that most people are aware when something's stereotyped. And my sense is that working people will understand that that's a caricature, and it's not meant to be their lived experience. And I don't know if you agree, but we've seen people resisting at a level that I've never experienced in my entire lifetime. Google workers walking out. 60% of the workforce in one day was pretty incredible. The Fight for 15 movement, fast food workers have been in the streets for 8 years, and they're not giving up.
Yep.
And teachers are rising up all over the country. So I think that's a huge... that's the story that we should tell. That's the past, and I think working people are writing the future.
I also think there's a huge generational change as well. There's a lot of young people in particular. Not
Yes.
that old people,
Yes.
older people aren't necessarily behind the union cause, but I think young people in particular see a possibility, see a promise in
Yeah.
unionization and collective action that the older generations might not.
Right.
Mary Kay, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Derek.
Thank you.
Thank you.